Ever wondered why some rock music makes you feel like you're sitting in a concert hall rather than a smoky dive bar? That moment when a guitar solo suddenly gives way to a Moog synthesizer playing Bach-like counterpoint, or when a drummer abandons the backbeat to explore polyrhythms that would make Stravinsky nod in approval. These are the moments that define progressive rock. They're also the moments that divide listeners into those who roll their eyes and those whose pupils dilate with excitement. Progressive rock stands as rock music's most ambitious offspring. A rebellious child who studied classical piano, discovered psychedelics, and returned home determined to merge Beethoven with blues licks. It's the fascinating result of musicians who weren't content with 3 chords and the truth, who instead sought to expand rock's vocabulary until it could speak in the complex dialects of Western art music while retaining the visceral power of amplified guitars and thunderous percussion. The story begins in the late 1960s, when rock had already experienced several evolutionary leaps from its rhythm and blues origins. The Beatles had demonstrated that popular music could be artistically ambitious with albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, employing orchestral arrangements and studio techniques previously reserved for classical recordings. Meanwhile, bands like Cream and Jimi Hendrix had pushed the boundaries of instrumental virtuosity within rock frameworks. But progressive rock proper emerged when musicians began consciously incorporating classical structures, harmonic language, and compositional techniques into rock music. Groups like King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Pink Floyd weren't merely adding orchestral flourishes to rock songs. They were fundamentally rethinking what rock music could be. The classical influence manifested in multiple dimensions. Harmonically, prog abandoned the I-V progressions of traditional rock for modal explorations, extended chords, and chromatic modulations. Melodically, guitarists and keyboardists traded blues scales for Dorian and Phrygian modes, neoclassical arpeggios, and a tonal experimentation. Rhythmically, the steady 4/4 pulse gave way to shifting time signatures, polyrhythms, and metric modulations worthy of Stravinsky or Bartók. Form underwent the most dramatic transformation. The 3-minute single exploded into side-long suites with multiple movements, recurring motifs, and thematic development reminiscent of classical sonata form. ELP's adaptation of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition exemplified this approach, as did Yes's Close to the Edge, a 19-minute composition structured around clearly delineated sections that function like movements in a symphony. Instrumentation expanded dramatically. Keith Emerson's Hammond organ and Moog synthesizer, Rick Wakeman's array of keyboards, and Ian Anderson's flute became as essential to the prog sound as guitars and drums. Mellotron simulated string sections, while some bands incorporated actual orchestras. King Crimson's use of the mellotron on In the Court of the Crimson King created a haunting orchestral atmosphere previously unheard in rock. The classical influence wasn't merely structural or instrumental, it was philosophical. Progressive musicians approached composition with the seriousness of purpose traditionally associated with art music. They viewed their albums as complete works, deserving the same analytical attention as symphonies or string quartets. This attitude extended to performance, where technical precision became paramount. The casual spontaneity of early rock was replaced by meticulously rehearsed executions of complex arrangements. This classical orientation manifested in the musicians' backgrounds. Many had formal training. Rick Wakeman studied at the Royal College of Music, while Keith Emerson was classically trained from childhood. Others were autodidacts who studied classical scores and techniques. Robert Fripp developed his own guitar method based partly on classical principles, while Frank Zappa's compositions reflected his deep study of Varese and Stravinsky. The relationship between prog and classical music wasn't one-sided appropriation. It represented a genuine attempt at synthesis, taking rock's energy and classical music's complexity to create something that transcended both traditions. At its best, prog achieved this synthesis brilliantly. Listen to Genesis's Firth of Fifth, where Tony Banks's classically influenced piano introduction gives way to a rock ensemble that maintains the thematic development throughout, culminating in Steve Hackett's soaring guitar solo over the piano theme. a perfect marriage of rock expressiveness and classical structure. This synthesis wasn't without tension. Critics often derided prog as pretentious, rock musicians playing dress-up in classical clothing, without truly understanding the traditions they borrowed from. This criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Some prog compositions did come across as superficial imitations of classical forms without the underlying musical logic. Yet the best prog composers understood classical principles deeply enough to transform them into something genuinely original. The classical influence in prog rock wasn't limited to European traditions. YES's John Anderson and Steve Howe incorporated elements of Indian classical music, particularly in works like Close to the Edge, where modal improvisation over drone notes reflects raga principles. King Crimson explored gamelan-influenced percussion, especially during their 1980s incarnation. These explorations reflected a cosmopolitan approach to art music that transcended Western boundaries. Prog's classical aspirations extended beyond music to lyrics and themes. Bands crafted elaborate concept albums addressing philosophical, mystical, and science fiction themes. YES's lyrics explored cosmic consciousness and spiritual transcendence. Genesis created narrative song cycles based on mythological archetypes. These approaches echoed the programmatic aspects of romantic classical music, where compositions often told stories or explored philosophical ideas. The visual aesthetics of prog also reflected classical influences. Album covers by artists like Roger Dean and Storm Thorgerson created fantastical landscapes that functioned as visual analogues to the music, much as program notes and staging enhanced the experience of classical works. Live performances incorporated theatrical elements reminiscent of opera, particularly in Peter Gabriel-era Genesis and Jethro Tull shows. The classical influence wasn't static. It evolved throughout prog's history. Early prog, 1969-72, often directly quoted classical pieces. ELP's adaptations of Copland, Bartók, and Ginastera, or Jethro Tull's references to Bach. By mid-decade, bands like Gentle Giant and King Crimson had absorbed classical influences so thoroughly that they created highly original music that couldn't be categorized as either rock or classical, but existed in a genuinely new sonic territory. This evolution reflected the changing relationship between classical and popular music more broadly. As conservatory-trained composers began incorporating rock elements into their work, Philip Glass writing for electric organs, for instance, the boundary between art music and popular music became increasingly permeable. Prog stood at this intersection, challenging the hierarchical distinction between high and low culture that had dominated Western music discourse. The progressive in progressive rock wasn't just about musical complexity. It reflected a belief in artistic evolution. These musicians saw themselves as pushing rock forward into new territory, just as classical composers had advanced their tradition through centuries of innovation. This progressive ethos manifested in constant experimentation. Bands rarely made the same album twice. King Crimson's transformation from the mellotron-drenched grandeur of their debut to the angular proto-math rock of Lark's Tongues and Aspic exemplifies this restless innovation. This progressive attitude extended to instrumental technique. Guitarists like Robert Fripp and Steve Howe developed approaches that incorporated classical fingerpicking, jazz voicings, and extended techniques. Bassists like Chris Squire and Geddy Lee elevated their instrument from timekeeping to melodic counterpoint. Drummers like Bill Bruford and Neil Peart brought orchestral thinking to percussion, treating the kit as a collection of voices in conversation rather than merely marking time. The classical influence manifested most dramatically in virtuosity. Prog musicians displayed technical prowess that would have impressed conservatory professors. Listen to Rick Wakeman's keyboard runs on The Six Wives of Henry VIII, which incorporate Baroque ornamentation and Lisztian pyrotechnics while maintaining rock sensibilities. Or consider John McLaughlin's work with Mahavishnu Orchestra, fusing classical precision with jazz improvisation and rock intensity. This emphasis on virtuosity became a double-edged sword. At its best, technical mastery served musical expression. Think of Steve Hackett's lyrical guitar work on Blood on the Rooftops, which uses classical techniques to achieve emotional depth impossible with standard rock approaches. At its worst, technique became an end itself, resulting in soulless displays of mechanical proficiency, the musical equivalent of solving complex equations without understanding their significance. By the late 1970s, punk rock emerged partly as a reaction against prog's perceived excesses. Punk's deliberate simplicity, emotional directness, and DIY ethos stood in stark contrast to prog's complexity, cerebral approach, and technical demands. The punk critique wasn't entirely misplaced. Prog had sometimes lost sight of rock's visceral impact in pursuit of classical sophistication, yet this critique overlooked prog's emotional depth, which, though expressed differently than punk's raw anger, was no less authentic. The relationship between prog and mainstream classical institutions remained complicated. Despite prog's classical aspirations, the classical establishment largely ignored or dismissed it. Few music conservatories studied prog compositions. Few classical critics reviewed prog albums. This institutional rejection reflected ongoing prejudices about popular music's artistic validity, regardless of its complexity or ambition. Meanwhile, prog maintained an ambivalent relationship with the rock world, too complex for mainstream radio, too electric for classical venues. Prog created its own parallel ecosystem of devoted fans, specialized music press, and extended concert experiences. This semi-detached position allowed creative freedom, but limited cultural impact, creating a situation where some of the most ambitious music of the era remained relatively marginalized. The classical influence in prog wasn't merely backward-looking nostalgia. The most innovative prog bands incorporated contemporary classical techniques from composers like Messiaen, Ligeti, and Stockhausen. King Crimson's use of dissonance, aleatoric elements, and timbral experimentation in works like Lark's Tongues in Aspic reflected awareness of avant-garde classical developments. Frank Zappa's compositions, especially for his orchestral projects, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modernist classical techniques. This engagement with contemporary classical idioms distinguished prog from mere classical pastiche. When YES incorporated counterpoint, they weren't simply imitating Bach. They were applying contrapuntal thinking to create something new within rock contexts. When Gentle Giant explored Renaissance vocal techniques on Three Friends, they transformed these ancient approaches into something distinctly modern, through electronic processing and rock rhythms. The tension between classical complexity and rock's directness created prog's distinctive energy. The most successful prog compositions maintained rock's visceral power, while employing classical sophistication. Listen to Rush's La Via Strangiato, which combines hard rock intensity with orchestral development and counterpoint. Or consider Van der Graaf Generator's A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, where Peter Hamill's raw vocal delivery provides emotional immediacy amid complex instrumental arrangements. Prog's classical orientation wasn't limited to composing and performing. It extended to listening practices. Prog encouraged attentive, focused listening more associated with classical concerts than rock shows. Albums were designed to be experienced in their entirety, preferably through headphones, with listeners following the musical development like audience members at a symphony. This approach challenged passive consumption and invited active engagement with musical structures. This emphasis on attentive listening influenced album production. Prog recordings featured dynamic range, spatial depth, and timbral detail closer to classical recordings than compressed rock productions. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, with its meticulous sound staging and dynamic contrasts, exemplifies this approach. It's no coincidence that audiophiles still use it to evaluate high-end sound systems, just as they might use Deutsche Grammophon recordings of Beethoven. The classical influence extended to business practices. While most rock bands followed hit-driven careers, prog groups adopted the album-oriented approach of classical artists. Commercial singles were often afterthoughts or reluctant concessions to record companies. This artistic over commercial attitude reflected classical music's traditional separation from market considerations, though prog operated within commercial contexts that classical composers largely avoided. By the 1980s, prog's classical aspirations faced challenges from multiple directions. New Wave's minimalism, punk's anti-virtuosity stance, and disco's rhythmic focus all rejected prog's complexity. The era's synthesizer technology encouraged simpler textures over orchestral density. Mainstream rock returned to blues-based directness, while MTV prioritized visual impact over musical sophistication. Some prog musicians adapted by streamlining their approach. YES's 90125 maintained progressive elements within more accessible frameworks. Genesis transformed from art rock innovators to mainstream pop stars. Rush incorporated new wave influences while preserving technical complexity. These adaptations maintained some classical elements while acknowledging changing tastes. Others doubled down on their classical orientation. Bands like Marillion emerged carrying the torch of symphonic prog, while King Crimson's 1980s incarnation explored minimalist-influenced polyrhythms with classical precision. Meanwhile, neoclassical metal guitarists like Yngwie Malmsteen explicitly fused classical virtuosity with heavy metal power, creating a parallel tradition of classically influenced rock. The 1990s saw prog's classical side retreat further underground, as grunge and alternative rock championed authenticity through simplicity. Yet this period also witnessed the emergence of progressive metal, where bands like Dream Theater combined prog's classical influences with metal's intensity. Listen to Dream Theater's Metropolis P1, with its Bach-influenced keyboard runs, contrapuntal guitar keyboard dialogues, and multi-movement structure. Classical thinking thoroughly integrated with metal power. Simultaneously, post-rock bands like Godspeed You! Black Emperor adopted classical approaches to form and development, creating extended instrumental pieces that evolved gradually like minimalist compositions. Though aesthetically distant from 1970s prog, these bands shared its interest in extended structures and orchestral textures, demonstrating classical thinking's continued relevance to rock's evolution. The digital revolution transformed prog's relationship with classical influences. Tools previously available only in expensive studios became accessible to bedroom producers. Software instruments simulated orchestras convincingly. Online communities connected classical rock fusionists globally. These developments democratized the classical rock synthesis that prog pioneered, allowing independent artists to create orchestrally influenced rock without major label support. Contemporary prog bands like Haken, The Deer Hunter, and Thank You Scientist continue exploring classical rock synthesis, often with greater stylistic breadth than their predecessors. Thank You Scientist integrates jazz harmony, classical counterpoint, and rock energy seamlessly. The Deer Hunter creates rock operas with sophisticated orchestrations that reflect deep understanding of classical composition. These bands build on prog's classical foundations while incorporating influences unavailable to earlier generations. Modern classical composers increasingly acknowledge rock influences, including progressive rock specifically. Composers like Bryce Dessner, of The National, write orchestral works that reflect both classical training and rock experience. Contemporary classical ensembles perform arrangements of King Crimson and Gentle Giant. This cross-pollination suggests a maturing relationship between traditions that prog helped initiate. What distinguishes effective classical rock fusion from mere pretension? The answer lies in integration, rather than juxtaposition. When classical elements are grafted onto rock structures without organic connection, the result feels artificial, like wearing a tuxedo over jeans. When classical thinking informs every aspect of composition and performance, from harmonic language to formal development to instrumental technique, the result transcends both traditions to create something genuinely new. The most successful prog compositions achieve this integration. Genesis's Supper's Ready, despite its 23-minute length and multiple sections, maintains thematic coherence throughout, with motifs reappearing in transformed contexts, a classical approach to development applied to rock instrumentation and energy. Pink Floyd's Echoes uses classical principles of tension and release across an extended form while maintaining rock's rhythmic drive and textural approach. Prog's classical aspirations reflect deeper questions about artistic hierarchies. By bringing classical complexity to rock contexts, Prague challenged distinctions between high and low art that dominated Western culture. This challenge wasn't merely aesthetic, but philosophical and political, questioning who decides what constitutes serious music and on what basis these judgments are made. This challenge explains both Prague's appeal and the backlash against it. Prague fans appreciated its dismantling of artificial boundaries between musical traditions. Critics saw pretension in rock musicians adopting classical trappings, particularly when these musicians lacked formal training in classical tradition. Both perspectives contain partial truths about Prague's relationship with classical music. Today, the classical rock synthesis continues evolving. Radiohead's Johnny Greenwood composes film scores and orchestral works alongside his rock output. Steven Wilson produces meticulously crafted albums that draw from both classical development and rock intensity. Bands like Bent Knee combine conservatory training with experimental rock approaches. These artists inherit Prague's ambition while developing distinct approaches to classical rock integration. What remains constant is the tension between classical complexity and rock directness, the challenge of creating music sophisticated enough to reward repeated listening, while immediate enough to connect emotionally on first hearing. This balance defined progressive rock's achievement. At its best, Prague delivered intellectual stimulation and emotional resonance simultaneously, offering both the cerebral satisfaction of following complex musical development and the visceral thrill of powerful rock dynamics. The classical influence in progressive rock wasn't merely stylistic borrowing. It represented a fundamental rethinking of what popular music could achieve. By bringing classical ambition to rock contexts, Prague musicians expanded rock's expressive range and formal possibilities. Though fashions change and critical reputations rise and fall, this expansion remains Prague's lasting contribution to musical evolution. For listeners discovering this tradition, progressive rock offers a unique musical journey, one that demands active engagement, but rewards it abundantly. Like classical music, Prague reveals its depths gradually, with repeated listening unveiling layers of detail and meaning initially hidden. Unlike most classical music, Prague delivers these depths with electric intensity and rhythmic drive that speaks directly to contemporary sensibilities. This combination, intellectual richness and emotional power, compositional sophistication and performative energy, historical awareness and future orientation, defines progressive rock's distinctive achievement. By consciously evoking art music traditions within rock frameworks, Prague created a musical territory where Bach and blues, Stravinsky and psychedelia, Debussy and distortion could coexist not as awkward neighbors, but as integrated elements of a coherent musical language. That language continues evolving today, spoken by musicians who might not identify as progressive, but who share Prague's ambition to create music that challenges and rewards in equal measure. In this ongoing evolution, we hear Prague's most important lesson, that musical boundaries exist to be transcended, that traditions gain vitality through cross-pollination, and that the most exciting music often emerges where different worlds collide.